Sometimes the thing that saves your life is buried so deep you don't even know it exists yet. I remember thinking about that line later, long after the night everything changed. But at the time all I knew was that my dog had suddenly started digging like his life depended on it. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs as I walked along the narrow dirt trail behind the small rental house I could barely afford outside Cedar Ridge, Colorado. My breath came out in pale clouds, drifting under the glow of a thin crescent moon. It was a little after 10, the hour when the world finally quieted down and a single mom, like me, could steal 20 minutes of silence after putting her 6-year-old daughter to bed. Titan lumbered ahead of me, his massive gray body moving with surprising grace for a dog that weighed close to 150 pounds. Neapolitan Mastiffs aren't subtle animals. When Titan decided something mattered, the entire world usually knew about it. At first I thought he'd caught the scent of a raccoon or maybe a deer passing through the woods. The trail ran along the edge of a patch of state land, and wildlife wandered through all the time. But Titan didn't bark. He didn't chase. He stopped near a cluster of pine trees about 20 yards off the trail and began digging straight down into the damp earth with a kind of desperate focus I had never seen before. Dirt flew behind him in dark clumps, the sound of his paws tearing into the soil loud in the quiet night. "Titan," I called softly, tightening my jacket around myself. "Hey, easy boy." He ignored me completely. That was my first hint something wasn't normal. Titan was trained. Protective, stubborn sometimes, but trained. When I stepped closer, my boots sank slightly into the soft ground, and the smell of freshly turned earth rose into the cold air. Titan paused just long enough to glance back at me, those heavy amber eyes wide and alert. Then he started digging even faster. The hole was already nearly 2 feet deep. "What on earth did you find?" I muttered, crouching beside him. I expected to see the edge of an old log, or maybe the remains of some animal the forest had claimed months ago. Instead, I saw something pale under the dirt. At first, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. It was the shape of it that stopped my breath. Not a branch, not a rock. Fingers. Human fingers. For a second, the world felt completely still, like the woods themselves were holding their breath with me. My heart began pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Titan stepped aside slightly, almost like he understood that whatever was in that hole belonged to me now. My hands started shaking as I brushed away more dirt with my gloves. A wrist. A sleeve of dark fabric. Then a hand moved. Just barely. But it moved. I stumbled backward, my boots slipping on loose soil as the realization hit me all at once. Someone was down there. Someone alive. My pulse raced as I grabbed my phone from my pocket with numb fingers, the screen lighting up the darkness. 911. I whispered to myself, already dialing, my voice shaking as Titan stood beside the hole, silent and watchful like a guardian over the impossible thing we had just uncovered in the middle of the Colorado woods. I could barely hear the emergency operator over the pounding in my chest as Titan stood beside the hole, his massive body rigid and alert like he understood this moment mattered. The woman on the phone kept her voice calm, the way people do when they know panic will not help anyone. She asked for my location, asked me to confirm what I had found, asked if the person was breathing. I swallowed hard and forced myself to look again. The man was half buried in damp soil, the earth packed tightly around his shoulders and chest. Only part of his arm and the side of his face were visible under the thin beam of my phone light. His skin looked pale against the dark dirt, but I could see the faint rise and fall of his breathing. Slow, weak, but real. "Yes," I said, my voice shaking despite my best effort to stay calm. "He is alive. I think he is alive." The operator told me help was already on the way and asked me to stay on the line. My hands trembled as I crouched beside the hole again. Titan lowered his head slightly and sniffed the air, then sat beside me like a silent bodyguard. I brushed away more dirt carefully, using my gloves and the small folding shovel I carried on walks because mountain trails sometimes needed clearing after storms. The soil was cold and heavy, clinging to everything. Inch by inch the man's shoulder and upper chest came into view. He was wearing a dark coat, the kind that looked expensive even when covered in mud. That detail felt strange in the middle of the forest at night. This was not hiking gear. This was city clothing. The operator kept talking gently through the phone, guiding me through what to do and what not to do. She told me not to pull too hard, and not to move him more than necessary until emergency crews arrived. I nodded even though she could not see me. My breath came out fast in the cold air as I cleared enough space around his face for him to breathe more easily. Titan shifted closer, his large body pressing lightly against my leg. The man's eyelids moved slightly. Just a faint twitch. Then his eyes opened for half a second before closing again. Dark eyes. Sharp even in that brief moment. I froze, staring down at him. "Sir," I said quietly, unsure if he could hear me. "Help is coming. Just stay still." The woods were silent except for the sound of my breathing and the occasional rustle of pine branches overhead. Then, far in the distance, I heard it. Sirens. Faint at first, but growing louder as they moved along the narrow county road that ran past the trail entrance. Relief washed through me, so suddenly my knees almost gave out. Titan's ears perked up at the sound. I stayed beside the hole, one hand resting lightly on the cold ground near the man's shoulder as the lights from the approaching vehicles began to flicker through the trees. In less than 10 minutes, the quiet forest filled with movement and voices. Paramedics moved quickly but calmly, kneeling beside the hole with flashlights and medical equipment. They carefully widened the opening and lifted the man onto a stretcher with practiced precision. Someone draped a thermal blanket over him, while another medic checked his pulse and breathing. One of the responders turned to me. "You the one who found him?" he asked. I nodded, suddenly aware that my clothes were streaked with dirt and my hands would not stop shaking. Titan stood at my side, watching everything with steady eyes. The medic gave a short whistle under his breath as he glanced down at the man on the stretcher. "Well," he muttered quietly to one of the other responders, "whoever this guy is, he is lucky your dog decided to go digging tonight." I followed as they carried the stretcher toward the ambulance lights glowing through the trees. But none of us knew yet that the man Titan had uncovered was someone whose name could change the entire direction of my life. The ambulance doors closed with a heavy metallic sound that echoed through the quiet night as the paramedics lifted the stretcher inside. Red and white lights washed over the trees in slow pulses, turning the forest into a strange moving shadow of itself. I stood a few feet away holding Titan's leash, my hands still trembling as the cold air settled into my jacket. One of the paramedics turned back toward me before climbing into the vehicle. "We are taking him to Cedar Ridge Medical Center," he said calmly. "You might want to come in later to give a statement since you found him." I nodded, even though my mind still struggled to catch up with everything that had just happened. Titan stayed close to my leg as the ambulance pulled away, its lights disappearing down the narrow road, while 2 sheriff vehicles remained parked near the trail entrance. A deputy with a flashlight approached me slowly, his boots crunching over the gravel path. He looked to be in his mid-40s with a weathered face that suggested he had lived in this mountain town most of his life. "Ma'am, I am Deputy Collins," he said gently. "You were the one who called it in?" "Yes," I answered, my voice finally steadying. "My dog found him." Collins glanced down at Titan with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "Well, that is one impressive dog," he said. "Most people would have walked right past that spot." Titan sat calmly beside me, his massive head level with my hip, watching the deputy with patient eyes. Collins asked a few basic questions while another officer took photographs near the disturbed patch of ground. I explained the walk, the digging, the moment I saw the hand under the dirt. Saying the words out loud made the whole situation feel even more unreal. The deputy wrote notes on a small pad while occasionally glancing toward the hole Titan had uncovered. "Strange place for something like this," he murmured more to himself than to me. After a few minutes, he closed the notebook and nodded. "You did the right thing calling immediately," he said. "You may have saved that man's life." The weight of those words settled over me slowly. Saved his life. I looked down at Titan and scratched behind his thick ear. "He did most of the work," I said quietly. Collins gave a faint smile. "Still counts." By the time the officers finished their work, nearly half an hour had passed. The woods returned to their normal silence as the last sheriff vehicle drove away. I stood alone on the trail for a moment, the cold finally creeping through my boots. Titan gave a low huff, as if reminding me it was time to go home. The walk back felt longer than usual. My mind kept replaying the image of the man's face under the dirt and the brief moment his eyes had opened. Something about that look had stayed with me. It was not confusion. It was not fear. It had been sharp and aware, even through exhaustion. When Titan and I reached the small house I rented at the edge of town, warm light glowed from the kitchen window. My daughter Lily must have turned on the night lamp again like she always did when she woke up and did not see me right away. Inside the house, everything felt normal in the quiet way that life with a child often does. Lily slept on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her small shoulders and one of her stuffed animals clutched tightly in her arms. I carried her gently back to her bed, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead before turning off the light. Titan settled down near the front door like a stone statue guarding the house. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen sink staring out at the dark mountains beyond the yard. The events of the night felt distant already, like something that belonged to another world entirely. But the next morning, when I arrived at the hospital to give my statement, I would learn something about the man Titan had found buried beneath the earth. Something that would explain why the entire emergency room suddenly went silent the moment his name was spoken. The hospital waiting room smelled like coffee and disinfectant, the kind of scent that never quite leaves a place where people spend their nights worrying about things they cannot control. I sat in a plastic chair near the wall with Titan lying beside my feet, his huge body taking up nearly half the floor space. The nurses at Cedar Ridge Medical Center had given us a few curious looks when we walked in, but no one complained. Titan had that effect on people. Even when they were unsure about his size, something about his calm presence made them trust him. A few minutes earlier, a receptionist had taken my name and asked me to wait while someone from the sheriff's department finished speaking with the doctors. The digital clock on the wall read 8:34 in the morning. Lily was at school, and the mountain sunlight poured through the large windows, making everything feel almost too normal after the strange events of the night before. I kept thinking about the man's face in the dirt and the way his eyes had opened for that single second. Titan shifted slightly, resting his massive head on his paws as if he understood we were waiting for something important. Across the room, two nurses whispered quietly while glancing down the hallway that led to the emergency wing. Their voices were low, but the silence of the waiting room carried every word. "That cannot really be him," one of them murmured. The other nurse shook her head slowly. Deputy Collins confirmed it. They checked his identification twice. The first nurse looked toward the hallway again, her voice dropping even lower. "I thought people like him did not end up in small hospitals like this." I tried not to stare, but curiosity pulled my attention toward them anyway. Something about their tone made my stomach tighten. A few seconds later, Deputy Collins stepped through the double doors from the emergency corridor. He spotted me immediately and walked over with the same calm expression he had worn the night before in the woods. "Morning, Ms. Carter," he said. "Thank you for coming down." I nodded and stood, Titan rising beside me like a silent shadow. Collins glanced at the dog and gave a small approving nod before lowering his voice slightly. "The doctors say he is stable now," he explained. "Still under observation, but he is conscious." I was not sure why that information made my heart beat faster. Maybe because it made the whole situation suddenly more real. "Do you know who he is?" I asked quietly. Collins studied my face for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. Then he exhaled slowly and glanced around the waiting room before answering. "His name is Adrian Romano." The name meant nothing to me at first. It hung in the air between us like a word I was supposed to recognize, but did not. Collins must have seen the confusion in my expression because he continued speaking in a lower voice. "Let us just say Mr. Romano is not exactly an ordinary visitor in a place like Cedar Ridge." Before I could ask another question, the atmosphere in the waiting room shifted. The glass doors at the hospital entrance slid open, and three men stepped inside wearing dark suits that looked expensive enough to belong in a big city boardroom rather than a mountain town clinic. They moved with quiet confidence, their eyes scanning the room with calm precision. Conversation stopped almost immediately. Even the nurses near the desk went silent. One of the men approached the reception counter and spoke quietly to the clerk, who nodded and pointed toward the emergency wing. Collins sighed under his breath and muttered just loud enough for me to hear. "Looks like Mr. Romano's people found him." Titan lifted his head slightly, watching the men with steady, alert eyes as they walked past us down the hallway. And in that moment I realized something simple but unsettling. Whoever Adrian Romano really was, the quiet life I had known in this small Colorado town might have just crossed paths with a world far bigger than I ever intended to enter. I did not realize how quiet the waiting room had become until the three men disappeared down the emergency hallway and the automatic doors closed behind them with a soft hiss. The silence felt heavier than before, like the entire hospital had suddenly started paying attention to something none of us fully understood. Titan remained beside me, his large head lifted slightly, those steady amber eyes tracking the direction the men had gone. Deputy Collins rubbed the back of his neck and exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered, "that did not take long." I glanced toward the hallway where the men had vanished. "Who are they?" I asked quietly. Collins hesitated for a moment before answering. "People who work for Adrian Romano," he said carefully. The way he said the name made it sound less like a person and more like something that carried weight far beyond this small hospital. I was about to ask another question when a nurse stepped through the double doors and scanned the waiting room. Her eyes landed on me almost immediately. "Emily Carter?" she asked. I stood, my heart beating faster without any clear reason why. Titan rose with me in one smooth motion. The nurse gave the dog a brief look, but did not object. "Mr. Romano asked to speak with you," she said. That sentence hung in the air for a second before my mind fully processed it. "He is awake?" I asked. "Yes," she replied. "And he was very specific about wanting to see the person who found him." Collins gave me a small nod as if to say it was all right. "Go ahead," he said. "I will be right out here." I followed the nurse down the hallway with Titan walking calmly beside me. The emergency wing looked different in daylight than it had the night before in flashing ambulance lights. Everything felt clean and quiet, but there was still a tension in the air that I could not quite explain. As we approached one of the private rooms, I noticed the same three men in dark suits standing nearby. They stepped aside slightly when they saw us coming, their attention shifting toward Titan for a brief moment before returning to the door. One of them opened it for the nurse without a word. Inside, the room was filled with soft morning light from a window that overlooked the mountains. Medical monitors hummed quietly beside the bed, and sitting upright against a stack of pillows was the man Titan had uncovered in the forest. Adrian Romano looked different now that he was cleaned up and no longer covered in dirt. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and the sharp lines of his face made him appear both younger and somehow more intimidating than I remembered. There was a calm intensity in his expression, the kind that made it feel like he noticed everything in the room at once. His eyes moved from me to Titan and then back again. The nurse stepped aside and quietly left the room. For a moment no one spoke. The air felt strangely still. Then Adrian Romano finally broke the silence. His voice was deep and steady, carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being heard the first time they spoke. "You are the one who found me." It was not a question. I nodded slowly. "My dog did," I said, glancing down at Titan. Romano's gaze shifted to the enormous Mastiff beside me. Something almost like approval flickered in his eyes. "A loyal animal," he said calmly. Then his attention returned to me and his expression softened just slightly, though the intensity never left his gaze. "You saved my life, Miss Carter." I was not sure how to respond to that. I had not thought about it that way. I had simply done what anyone would have done. But the way he said the words made them sound heavier than they should have been. After a moment he continued speaking, his voice quieter now, but no less certain. "That creates a debt." The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the meaning behind those words carried consequences I had not yet begun to understand. For a few seconds I did not say anything. The word debt hung in the air between us like something heavier than a simple thank you. Titan shifted slightly beside me, but stayed calm, his presence steady at my side. I looked at Adrian Romano, trying to understand the man behind the name everyone seemed to whisper about in the hallway. He did not look dangerous in the way movies usually show dangerous people. There were no raised voices or threatening gestures. Instead, there was a quiet certainty in the way he watched the room, like a man who already knew how every situation would end before anyone else had even begun thinking about it. I folded my arms lightly, suddenly aware of the hospital room, the machines humming beside his bed, and the three men standing outside the door who had clearly arrived the moment someone told them where he was. "You do not owe me anything," I said carefully. "Anyone would have called for help." Romano studied me for a moment as if measuring the truth of those words. Then he gave the smallest shake of his head. "No," he said calmly. "Most people would have kept walking in the dark woods and never noticed what your dog found." His gaze shifted briefly toward Titan again. "And most people would not have stayed." I had no good answer for that. Maybe he was right. Maybe a lot of people would have turned around the moment things started to look strange. But standing there now, I realized something else. Romano was not speaking like someone who expected gratitude. He was speaking like someone who followed rules that the rest of us did not even know existed. I am serious, I said, trying to keep the moment simple. You do not owe me anything. I just want to go back to my normal life. Romano leaned back slightly against the pillows, one hand resting calmly on the blanket covering his legs. The sunlight through the window cast a pale line across his face, highlighting the sharp edge of his jaw and the thoughtful look in his eyes. Normal life, he repeated quietly. That is a valuable thing. His tone carried something thoughtful, almost distant, as if the concept itself belonged to another world. For a moment the room fell silent again. Then he looked back at me with the same focused attention he had shown since I walked in. You have a daughter, he said. It was not a guess. My stomach tightened slightly. How do you know that? I asked. Romano's expression did not change. My people are careful, he replied simply. I glanced toward the door where the suited men stood just outside the room. The idea that strangers had already looked into my life made something uneasy stir in my chest. Romano must have noticed the shift in my expression because his voice softened slightly. Relax, Miss Carter, he said. It was only to understand who saved me. I took a slow breath and tried to let the tension fade. Titan remained perfectly calm beside me, which somehow helped more than anything else. Dogs had a way of sensing when someone meant harm, and Titan did not seem worried at all. Romano watched the dog for a moment and then gave a small nod, almost to himself. Your dog trusts you completely, he said. Animals are honest judges of character. I shrugged lightly. He mostly just likes snacks and long walks. For the first time, something close to a smile appeared at the corner of Romano's mouth. It disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Then his expression returned to that calm certainty again. Whether you want it or not, he said quietly, saving someone's life changes things. I felt a faint chill at those words, though the room was warm with sunlight. I do not want anything to change, I said. Romano looked at me for a long moment before answering. Sometimes the moment we wish to return to normal is exactly the moment the world decides something else. And for reasons I could not explain, hearing him say that made me feel as though the quiet life I had built in this small mountain town might already be standing at the edge of something much larger than I had ever expected. I left the hospital later that morning with Titan walking quietly beside me and the strange conversation with Adrian Romano still echoing in my thoughts. The mountain air outside felt sharper than usual, like the world had shifted slightly while I was inside that room. Deputy Collins gave me a short nod as I passed the waiting area and told me I was free to go home for now. I thanked him and stepped outside into the bright Colorado sunlight, hoping that once I returned to my routine, everything would feel normal again. Titan jumped into the back seat of my old pickup truck with the heavy grace of a dog who had done it 1,000 times before. The drive back to the house took about 15 minutes along the narrow road that curved through pine trees and rocky hillsides. Normally, I love that drive. It reminded me why I had moved to Cedar Ridge in the first place after my divorce 3 years earlier. Quiet town, clean air, a place where my daughter Lily could grow up without the noise and stress of the city. But that morning my thoughts kept drifting back to the hospital room and the calm certainty in Romano's voice when he talked about debts and changing worlds. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, Titan jumped down and trotted ahead of me toward the porch. The small rental house looked exactly the same as it always did. White paint slightly faded from the mountain sun. A wooden swing hanging near the front window. Nothing about it suggested that anything unusual had happened in my life during the past 12 hours. Lily's bright blue backpack sat near the door where she had dropped it before school that morning. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, letting Titan roam the living room while I poured myself another glass of water. The quiet felt comforting after the tension of the hospital. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that Romano had been wrong and that life really could return to normal. That feeling lasted about 20 minutes. I was standing at the kitchen counter scrolling through my phone when Titan suddenly lifted his head and gave a low warning sound deep in his chest. It was not a bark. Titan rarely barked without reason. This sound was something else, a signal that he had noticed something unusual outside. I walked toward the window and pushed the curtain aside slightly. 2 black vehicles were parked across the road about 50 yards from my driveway. They had not been there when I arrived home. Both engines were off, but the dark windows made it impossible to see inside. My stomach tightened slightly. Cedar Ridge was a quiet town. Strangers and expensive vehicles tended to stand out. Titan moved closer to the window beside me, his broad shoulders tense as he studied the road. The vehicles did not move. They simply sat there as if waiting. I told myself they could belong to hikers or visitors passing through the area. That explanation sounded reasonable for about 30 seconds. Then the driver's side door of the first vehicle opened, and a man stepped out. He was wearing a dark jacket and sunglasses, even though the morning sun was not very bright. He did not approach the house. He simply looked toward it for a moment before speaking briefly to someone still inside the vehicle. Titan let out another low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards beneath my feet. I watched the man for a few seconds before slowly letting the curtain fall back into place. A quiet realization began to form in the back of my mind. Adrian Romano had said that saving someone's life changed things. Standing in my kitchen with Titan watching the road and two unfamiliar vehicles parked outside my home, I began to suspect that the change he was talking about might have already started. I stood in the kitchen for nearly a full minute without moving, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of wind moving through the pine trees outside. Titan remained beside the window, his massive body still and focused, the deep rumble in his chest fading into a tense silence. I slowly walked back to the curtain and lifted the edge just enough to look outside again. The two black vehicles were still parked across the road. The man who had stepped out earlier was now leaning against the front of the first vehicle, speaking quietly to someone inside. Even from 50 yards away, there was something about the way he stood that made it clear he was not just passing through the area. He was watching the house. My house. Titan shifted his weight slightly and let out another low warning sound. I placed a hand gently on his neck, feeling the steady warmth of his thick skin beneath his collar. "Easy," I whispered. My mind ran through every normal explanation I could think of. Maybe they were hikers looking at maps. Maybe they were visiting someone further down the road. But deep down, I already knew the truth was probably connected to the man lying in that hospital bed. Adrian Romano. I stepped away from the window and pulled my phone from the counter. For a moment, I considered calling Deputy Collins to mention the vehicles outside my home. Before I could decide, Titan's ears lifted sharply again. A moment later, the quiet rumble of an approaching engine drifted up the driveway. I turned toward the front door just as a third vehicle appeared through the window beside the porch. This one was different from the other two. Dark gray instead of black. Clean. Expensive in a quiet way that did not need to announce itself. The vehicle rolled slowly up the gravel drive and came to a stop near the porch steps. Titan moved instantly to the door, standing tall and alert, but not barking. That alone told me something important. Whatever he sensed outside did not feel immediately threatening to him. I opened the door cautiously and stepped onto the porch. The mountain air was cool and bright under the midday sun. The driver door of the gray vehicle opened, and a tall man stepped out, wearing a charcoal suit that looked far too formal for a small Colorado town. He removed a pair of sunglasses and studied the house for a moment before his eyes settled calmly on me. There was no hurry in the way he moved, no tension in his posture, just quiet purpose. He walked toward the bottom step of the porch and stopped at a respectful distance. Titan stood beside me like a stone statue. The man gave the dog a brief glance before speaking. "Miss Carter," he said politely. His voice carried a smooth confidence that suggested he was used to serious conversations. I crossed my arms lightly, keeping my expression steady. "Yes." The man nodded once. "My name is Marco Valeni," he said. "I work for Mr. Adrian Romano." Hearing that name spoken so directly made the situation suddenly very real. I glanced briefly toward the road where the two black vehicles were still parked. "The people out there," I said carefully. "They are with you?" Valeni shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. His calm tone did not change, but something about his eyes grew more serious. "They are the reason I am here." Titan's ears shifted forward at the subtle change in the man's voice. Valeni took a slow breath and looked directly at me again. "Miss Carter," he said, "Mr. Romano asked me to bring you and your daughter somewhere safe." My stomach tightened instantly. "Safe from what?" I asked. Valeni glanced once toward the road before answering quietly. "From the people who did not expect Mr. Romano to survive the night in those woods." And standing there on my porch with Titan beside me and strangers watching my house from across the road, I realized that the quiet life I had tried so hard to build in this small mountain town had just crossed into a story far more dangerous than anything I had ever imagined. I stood on the porch for a long moment without answering, the cool mountain breeze moving through the pine trees behind the house, while Titan remained at my side like a living wall. Marco Valeni waited patiently at the bottom of the steps, his posture calm but alert, as if he understood that a decision like this could not be rushed. Across the road, the two black vehicles had not moved. One of the men inside them was now standing outside the driver door again, pretending to check something on his phone while occasionally glancing toward the house. I could feel Titan watching them as well, his body tense but controlled. "You are telling me those people are here because of the man in the hospital?" I said carefully. Valeni nodded once. "Yes. And you expect me to leave my house because of that?" I asked. His expression remained respectful but serious. "I expect nothing," he replied calmly. "But Mr. Romano asked me to explain the situation clearly so you can decide." I folded my arms and leaned lightly against the porch railing. "Then explain." Valeni glanced briefly toward the road again before speaking. "Mr. Romano has enemies," he said. "Some of them believe the events in the forest last night would remove him permanently. When he was found alive, that changed their plans." I felt a slow chill move through my chest. "What does that have to do with me?" Valeni met my eyes directly. "You were the one who found him," he said. "Anyone watching closely will assume you know something about what happened." I shook my head immediately. "I do not know anything. My dog started digging, and I called for help. That is it." "I believe you," Valeni said quietly. "Unfortunately, the people in those vehicles might not." Titan let out another low rumble, as if confirming that the situation outside the house was becoming more serious. I looked back through the window toward the empty living room, where Lily's backpack still rested near the door. The image of my daughter walking home from school in a few hours suddenly filled my mind with a sharp wave of worry. "How long would we have to leave?" I asked. Valeni seemed relieved that I had asked the question rather than refusing outright. "Only until things settle," he said. "Mr. Romano has a property outside Denver where you and your daughter would be safe." I hesitated again. The idea of trusting a stranger connected to a man like Adrian Romano should have sounded completely unreasonable. But standing on the porch with unfamiliar men watching my home from across the road made the alternative feel far more dangerous. Titan stepped slightly closer to me, his shoulder brushing my leg as if reminding me he was ready for whatever decision I made. I looked down at him for a second before turning back to Valeni. "My daughter gets out of school at 3:15, I said. "I am not leaving without her." Valeni nodded immediately. "Of course." I studied his face carefully, searching for any sign that he was hiding something. But the calm seriousness in his expression never changed. Finally, I took a slow breath and stepped back toward the door. "Give me 15 minutes, I said. "I need to pack a few things." Valeni gave a respectful nod and stepped back from the porch. "Take the time you need, Miss Carter." I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, while Titan walked to the window again to keep watch on the road. Just a few hours earlier, I had believed the strange events of the night before were already fading into memory. Now I was standing in my own living room preparing to leave my home because of a man I had met only once in a hospital room. And deep down I knew something else had changed too. Adrian Romano had said saving someone's life created a debt. What he had not said was that sometimes the person who saves you ends up sharing the consequences as well. I packed quickly because there was no other way to do it. When your life suddenly shifts direction, you do not have time to debate every decision. I moved through the small house, grabbing the things Lily would need first. A few sets of clothes. Her favorite blue sweater with the small white stars on the sleeves. The stuffed rabbit she had slept with since she was 4. Titan followed me from room to room like a quiet shadow, occasionally stopping near the window to glance toward the road. Every time he looked outside, the low tension in his posture reminded me that the two black vehicles were still there, watching, waiting. I placed everything inside a medium travel bag and zipped it shut just as the clock on the kitchen wall clicked past 2:20 in the afternoon. Lily's school was only 10 minutes away, which meant I needed to leave soon if I wanted to pick her up before the usual crowd of parents filled the parking lot. Titan walked beside me as I carried the bag to the front door. Through the curtain, I could see that Marco Valeni was still standing. near the gray vehicle in the driveway, speaking quietly into a phone while occasionally glancing toward the road. The two vehicles across the street had not moved. The same man in sunglasses leaned against the hood of one of them as if he had all the time in the world. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch again. Valeni ended his phone call immediately and walked a few steps closer. "Everything ready?" he asked calmly. I nodded and lifted the bag slightly. "I need to pick up my daughter." Valeni gave a small approving nod. I expected that. He glanced toward the road for a moment before speaking again. "I will follow you to the school. It will be easier if we leave together." Titan jumped into the back seat of my truck as I placed the bag beside him. The familiar smell of leather and dust inside the cab usually made me feel at home, but this time it felt like the beginning of something uncertain. I started the engine and slowly pulled out of the driveway. Valeni's gray vehicle followed a few yards behind me. As we passed the two vehicles parked across the road, I saw the man in sunglasses straighten slightly and watch us drive away. He did not try to stop us. He simply reached into his pocket and made a call. That single movement made the tension in my chest tighten even more. The drive to the elementary school felt longer than usual, even though it was the same road I had taken every afternoon for the past 2 years. Titan sat quietly behind me, his large head resting between the front seats as he looked out the windshield. When we pulled into the school parking lot, the bell had just rung. Children poured out of the building in colorful backpacks and excited voices that filled the afternoon air. The normal energy of that moment felt strangely comforting. I parked near the curb and stepped out just as Lily spotted me from the front steps. "Mom," she called happily, running across the sidewalk with the carefree energy only a 6-year-old can have. She wrapped her arms around my waist and looked up with a wide smile. "Why is Titan in the truck today?" she asked. I knelt down and brushed a strand of hair away from her eyes. "Because we are going on a little trip," I said gently. Her face lit up immediately. "Really?" I nodded and took her hand. As we walked toward the truck, I noticed Valeni standing near his vehicle across the parking lot, watching the surroundings with the calm awareness of someone trained to notice everything. Lily climbed into the passenger seat, and Titan leaned forward to greet her with a slow wag of his heavy tail. She giggled and wrapped her arms around his thick neck. I closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, taking one last look at the quiet school building behind us. Just that morning, my biggest concern had been finishing laundry and helping Lily with her reading homework. Now we were leaving town under the protection of a man connected to Adrian Romano. I started the truck again and pulled out of the parking lot with Valeni's gray vehicle close behind. And as Cedar Ridge slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror, I realized the life I had known there might not be waiting for us when we came back. The road out of Cedar Ridge curved through miles of pine forest and open stretches of mountain highway where the sky seemed wider than anywhere else in the country. I kept both hands steady on the steering wheel while Titan sat upright behind us, his large head resting between the front seats as he watched the road ahead with calm attention. Lily leaned back in the passenger seat, hugging her stuffed rabbit and looking out the window with wide curiosity. To her, this felt like the beginning of an adventure. To me, it felt like stepping into something I did not fully understand yet. Marco Valeni's gray vehicle remained a few car lengths behind us the entire time, never too close and never too far. Every time I checked the rearview mirror, I saw the same steady headlights following the curve of the road. We drove for nearly an hour before the mountains slowly began to flatten into rolling hills and wider highways. Lily eventually turned toward me with the simple honesty that only a child has. "Mom," she said softly, "are we moving?" The question caught me off guard. I glanced at her and forced a small, reassuring smile. "No," I said gently, "just visiting somewhere for a little while." She seemed satisfied with that answer and returned her attention to the passing scenery. Titan shifted slightly behind us, but remained relaxed, which helped calm the tension that had been sitting in my chest since we left town. As the afternoon faded into early evening, the highway signs began to mention Denver. The traffic grew thicker, and the quiet mountain air slowly gave way to the distant glow of city lights on the horizon. Valeni's vehicle signaled once and moved into the next lane, guiding us toward an exit that led away from the busy freeway and into a quieter stretch of road lined with tall fences and large properties hidden behind rows of trees. I followed him for another 15 minutes until we turned through a set of iron gates that opened automatically as the gray vehicle approached. The driveway beyond them curved through several acres of land before revealing a large stone house set against the hillside. It was not the kind of place you would ever see from the road. Private, quiet, built to stay hidden from the world outside. I parked beside Valeni's vehicle and stepped out of the truck while Titan jumped down beside me with a heavy thud. Lily climbed out moments later, looking around with open curiosity at the wide lawns and tall trees surrounding the house. The front door opened before we even reached the steps. A woman in her 40s wearing a simple navy jacket stepped outside with a calm, welcoming smile. "Ms. Carter," she said warmly, "Mr. Romano asked me to make sure you and your daughter are comfortable while you are here." I paused at the bottom of the steps. "He is already out of the hospital?" The woman shook her head gently. "No," she replied, "but he likes to know that the people under his protection are safe." The phrase "under his protection" sounded heavier than I expected. Lily squeezed my hand and looked up at me with excitement. "Mom, this place is huge." I forced another small smile for her sake and guided her toward the entrance while Titan walked quietly beside us. As we stepped inside the large stone house, I realized something that had not fully settled in my mind until that moment. This was no longer a short detour away from my normal life. The moment we passed through those gates, we had stepped fully into Adrian Romano's world. The inside of the house felt quieter than I expected for a place that large. Soft lights glowed along the hallway, and the faint smell of fresh coffee drifted from somewhere deeper in the building. The woman who greeted us introduced herself as Elena and led us through the wide entry hall with the calm confidence of someone who had managed this house for a long time. Lily walked beside me, looking around with open curiosity while Titan stayed close to my leg, his heavy paws silent on the polished floor. Everything about the house felt carefully arranged, but not cold. Large windows overlooked the hills outside, and the furniture looked comfortable rather than overly formal. It was the kind of place built for privacy more than show. Elena guided us into a spacious living room where a fire burned quietly in the stone fireplace. "You and your daughter will stay in the guest wing," she explained. "There are 2 rooms prepared already." Lily's eyes lit up when she noticed the tall shelves of books and the wide couch near the fire. "Can Titan stay with us?" she asked immediately. Elena smiled gently. "Of course." Mr. Romano was informed about the dog. That answer made me pause slightly. Even here, miles away from the hospital, Adrian Romano seemed to know exactly what was happening. Elena led us upstairs where 2 adjoining rooms overlooked the back gardens and a stretch of forest that climbed into the hills behind the property. The rooms were simple but comfortable, with soft blankets and large windows that let in the last light of evening. Lily placed her stuffed rabbit on the bed and ran to the window with excitement. "Mom, look," she said. "You can see the mountains." I walked beside her and rested a hand on her shoulder. The view really was beautiful. Far beyond the property fence, the hills rolled into the distance under the fading orange sky. For a brief moment, it almost felt peaceful. Titan settled down near the doorway like a quiet guardian, while Elena explained where the kitchen and dining room were located downstairs. "Dinner will be ready in about an hour," she said kindly. "You are safe here." After she left the room, Lily climbed onto the bed and began asking the endless stream of questions that only children can manage. "Is this Mr. Romano's house? Is he rich? Is he going to visit us?" I answered as simply as I could without giving her reasons to worry. "He owns the house," I said, "and he helped us find a safe place to stay." Lily seemed satisfied with that explanation and soon curled up beside Titan while watching the evening sky grow darker beyond the window. I stepped into the hallway for a moment to clear my head. The quiet of the house felt almost unreal compared to the tension that had surrounded us earlier in the day. That calm lasted only a few minutes. My phone buzzed in my hand with an unfamiliar number. I hesitated before answering, but curiosity won. "Emily Carter," I said softly. There was a brief pause on the other end before a familiar, deep voice responded. "Good evening, Miss Carter." Adrian Romano. Even through the phone, his calm presence carried the same steady authority I remembered from the hospital room. "I was informed that you and your daughter arrived safely," he continued. I leaned lightly against the hallway wall and glanced toward the room where Lily and Titan rested. "Yes," I said. "We are here." There was a quiet pause before he spoke again. "I regret that your life has become complicated because of what happened in those woods," he said. "But I assure you this situation will be handled." I listened to the calm certainty in his voice and realized something important. Adrian Romano did not sound like a man hoping things would work out. He sounded like someone who had already decided how the story would end. And somehow, whether I wanted it or not, Lily and I had become part of that story. The hallway was quiet after the call ended, but the calm in Adrian Romano's voice stayed with me long after I lowered the phone from my ear. I stood there for a moment listening to the distant sounds of the house settling for the night. Somewhere downstairs a door closed softly. In the room behind me, Lily laughed quietly as Titan shifted his massive body across the carpet. The normal sound of my daughter's voice felt like the only thing in the world that still belonged to my old life. I stepped back into the bedroom and watched her for a moment. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed, brushing Titan's heavy ears with both hands while telling him a story about school like he understood every word. Titan listened with the calm patience only a dog like him could have. When Lily noticed me watching, she smiled. "Mom, this place is nice," she said. "Are we staying here for a long time?" I walked over and sat beside her on the edge of the bed. "Just until things get quiet again," I said gently. She accepted the answer without worry and leaned against my shoulder. Children have a way of trusting the world more easily than adults. I wished I could borrow that feeling for even a few minutes. Outside the large window, the sky had turned deep blue as the last light disappeared behind the hills. A line of security lights along the property fence switched on automatically, casting long shadows across the grass. Titan lifted his head slightly when the lights came on, watching the dark edge of the forest beyond the fence before relaxing again. Even he seemed to understand that this place was designed to keep trouble outside. Later that evening, Elena called us down for dinner. The dining room was warm with soft light and a quiet fire burning in another stone fireplace. The meal was simple but comforting, the kind of food someone cooks when they want guests to feel at home rather than impressed. Lily talked happily about school and asked Elena questions about the garden behind the house. For a little while, the strange events of the past 2 days faded into the background. After dinner, we returned upstairs, and Lily quickly fell asleep curled beside Titan, while the night air moved softly through the open window. I remained awake longer, standing near the glass and looking out over the wide property. Somewhere far beyond the hills was the small town where my life had been simple only 48 hours earlier. Now I was standing inside the guarded estate of a man whose name carried enough weight to make hospital staff whisper. My phone vibrated once more in my hand. A short message appeared on the screen. "Everything is under control. Rest tonight. Romano." I read the words twice before locking the phone and placing it on the bedside table. There was something strangely reassuring about the certainty in that message, even though I barely knew the man who sent it. I looked once more at Lily, sleeping peacefully beside Titan, and realized that whatever world Adrian Romano belonged to, it had already become part of our lives. And as I turned off the lamp and let the room fall into darkness, one thought stayed quietly in my mind. Sometimes the moment you save a stranger is the exact moment that stranger becomes the person who changes your future.